Thank you to the members and partners that have joined us from nearly 100 organizations to hear from the candidate. My name is Jose Ortiz Jr., and I'm the Executive Director of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. For those of you who might be new to us, NYCETC supports the workforce development community to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. NYCETC's membership is composed of nearly 180 workforce providers, educational institutions, and labor management organizations that provide job training and employment services to over 500,000 New Yorkers, making us the largest city-based workforce development coalition in the country. Before we get started, all participants should know that you'll be muted for the duration of this call. Mr. Donovan will be provided an opportunity to talk to us about his candidacy and answer some questions in a fireside format. We'll then open it up for questions from some members and partners. Please send your questions throughout the conversation to Annie Garniva on my team in the chat box. Will help us streamline the Q&A portion so that we can get as many of your questions answered as possible. I want to thank Mr. Donovan for his leadership and for being here with us this morning. For some background on Mr. Donovan, Shaun Donovan was born and raised in New York City and attended the Dalton School in Manhattan. He's a graduate of Harvard University, including an AB in engineering from Harvard College, an MPA from John F. Kennedy School of Government, and a Master of Architecture from the Graduate School of Design. Mr. Donovan has spent his career working for the advancement of affordable and public housing. Most recently, Mr. Donovan was appointed by President Obama to his cabinet and served as the United States Secretary of Housing and Urban Development from 2009 to 2014, and Director of the U.S. Office of Management and Budget from 2014 to 2017. Prior to that, he was the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Housing and Preservation and Development from 2004 to 2009 under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. In February 2020, he filed paperwork to run for the mayor of New York City in the 2021 mayoral election. Shaun, welcome. It's good to see you, and thanks for being here with us.
Joey, great to be with you. This is as close as I could get to a fireside in my home. So looking forward to the conversation.
Well, it looks great. So thanks again for joining us. I want to just begin by allowing you to introduce yourself to our community. So tell us a little bit about yourself, including your work here in New York City under Mayor Bloomberg and nationally under President Obama, or anything else that you'd like to share.
I'd love to. And, you know, where I really want to start is my experience as a New Yorker growing up here. And I would say who I am was really formed by the New York City that I grew up in. I remember deeply the 1970s and 80s when I watched homelessness explode. I was walking past families sleeping on the streets on the way to school. I remember the Bronx burning, the fires, and this sense that the civic bonds that hold this city together were breaking. And that was really kind of the crucible that I grew up in. And for me, it was a contrast to the opportunity that I saw that my father had. I'm the son of an immigrant. My grandfather was one of 11 poor Irish kids, worked the docks as a teenager in London, and traveled the world to try to make a go of it, to try to make a living for himself, and made enough to send my dad to school here in the United States, a classic story. And he came to New York because it was a city of opportunity for him. And so on the one hand, I saw this story that allowed me to get a great education and to get ahead, and at the same time witnessed the city I loved really facing an unprecedented moment of crisis. And that was what formed who I am. I started volunteering in a homeless shelter in college. When I got out of college, I went to work for the National Coalition for the Homeless. When I finished my graduate school, I came right back to New York to start working for a nonprofit starting in the Bronx, a nonprofit called the Community Preservation Corporation that was trying to rebuild neighborhoods. And for 30 years since that time, I have dedicated my life and my career to advancing housing, ending homelessness, but also more broadly to racial and economic justice. And that's who I am. Obviously, I was enormously lucky to be able to serve both as housing commissioner in New York City and then to get tapped for President Obama's cabinet. And what I would really say is that the through line from the very beginning of growing up in New York City to this moment is that I have always tried to dedicate myself to creating a progressive vision, to working on a vision. And I think that's one of the things that really distinguishes me in this campaign, is that I am somebody for my entire career, over 30 years, who's been focused on public service and trying to make economic and racial justice a reality. And I think what you'll see is that relative to any of the other candidates in the race, I'm somebody who not only has that progressive vision, but has actually gotten big, bold, progressive things done. Under President Obama, we brought down family homelessness by a third. We cut veterans' homelessness in half. I was the first cabinet secretary ever to endorse marriage equality. I was a pioneer on trying to make sure that our housing in our neighborhoods around the country were more racially just. And in fact, you see that today. President Trump is attacking me on Twitter and the work that I did because it was an important part of making our housing in our neighborhoods more inclusive. And so that record is not just about progressive vision, it's about progressive accomplishments. And at the end of the day, I think that's what New Yorkers are going to be looking for. They want a mayor who can make the city work for everyone, and I can be that mayor.
I should say that if the president's attacking you on Twitter, you're probably doing something right. So,
I'm with you on that, Joey.
So as I mentioned earlier, you filed to run back in February. At that time, why did you decide to run for mayor?
Well, look, even before these twin crises emerged, just a month after I filed to run, I deeply believed that this was a moment of urgent need to move the city forward. What I saw was increasingly a city that was becoming a place that was too hard for people of color, low-income folks to live, to find jobs, increasingly unaffordable. And I really deeply believe, Joey, that over the next decade, if we can't make this a city that works for everyone, it's not going to be the city that we all love. It's not going to have a place for people to come from across the world, people to come from other parts of the United States, or even born and bred New Yorkers to find a future for themselves, to see themselves in the future of this city. You know, I'm a historian of the civil rights movement and of many other parts of our history. And I think all of us in this movement for Black lives in this moment are really trying to examine the history of the country and our own history. And I think one of the things that you see if you look at that history is that we saw one great Black migration at the beginning of the 20th century into our cities. I think what we're witnessing now is a second great Black migration, where people of color are being pushed out of our cities. I believe gentrification and affordability is an enormous challenge. And I think it will continue to be a challenge even in these twin crises that we're facing. Similarly, I deeply believe that climate change is an existential crisis. If we can't do something about it, if we don't really begin to make change and reimagine what our city looks like and how we build it, we're going to start suffering the effects of climate change in ways we never imagined. And so that's what I felt before I filed. And you know, I think the final thing I would say is that, you know, I was in the White House the day of the 2016 election, having worked all 8 years for President Obama. And the day that Donald Trump was elected was a crisis, obviously, for all of us, for this country and for the world, but it was very personal as well. I think like so many people across the country, I had to ask myself, even though I'd been a public servant all my career, not a politician, what was I going to do? That I had to take personal responsibility. And obviously for many people, that means voting. That means participating in our public processes, getting active in their neighborhoods in different ways. For me, what that meant was taking the step to run for office for the first time in my life. And again, I think what distinguishes me, I've been a public servant my entire career, not a politician. And I think when people look at me in this race, what they'll see is somebody who's been working for 30 years on behalf of those causes. And when Donald Trump was elected and started to turn public service into self-service, it lit a fire in me to run for office for the first time.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you alluded to it, and you referenced it as, in terms of my next question, you referenced to it as these twin pandemics that we're experiencing. But I want to just kind of take a step back and provide a little bit of additional context. The world has changed dramatically since February, of course. And since through May, over 1.25 million New Yorkers face unemployment and steep economic insecurity. Nearly 900,000 private sector and government jobs have been lost, and 330,000 independent contractors have filed for pandemic unemployment assistance. The city's unemployment rate now stands at just over 20%, with marginalized communities facing the highest rate of displacement. Given your announcement in February, and given everything that's happened, including the Black Lives Matter movement, and the protests that really rocked the country and our city in particular over the last couple of months, how have your priorities changed?
Well, Joey, look, and I talked about it a moment ago, these were issues, whether it was preparing the city for crisis or racial and economic equity, that have been important to me for decades. And, just to take an example, I wrote about in the New York Times my work on fair housing on Martin Luther King Day in January. And so I've deeply believed that this country needs to be a fairer, more inclusive place, going back to my earliest days growing up in New York. Having said that, I think what this moment calls all of us to do is to look at ourselves, to look at our communities, and to do more, to reimagine the way that we can all respond. I'm the father of two young men. And to be honest, I look at them and think, how can it be that we live in a world where my sons haven't had to fear the police in their communities, fear discrimination in the same way of my friends' children and my neighbors' children of color? And I've had to ask myself, what more can I be doing? What more can they be doing? We've marched together. We've talked together. And I think we've, like every New Yorker and American of conscience, we've had to re-examine who we are and all of the both overt and subtle ways that systemic racial discrimination in this country affects our lives. And the other thing, honestly, that I've had to do is say, I may be running for mayor, but that election is almost a year away, the primary. And my city's in trouble now, and I need to step up and do more. And so I've done a few things. First, as I saw people in the South Bronx, in so many communities around this city, waiting hours in line to get food, going hungry, they're having to make brutal choices to pay the rent or put food on the table or buy a computer for their kids to be able to continue learning. As I've seen those choices, I went to work. I partnered with neighborhood restaurants around the city on an initiative called Common Table, and we've now delivered tens of thousands of meals in some of the hardest hit neighborhoods directly to people's door using technology. They can order by text on their phone and get a hot, fresh, healthy meal delivered directly to their door because of that work. Similarly, because of my expertise, both at the local and national level, I've been talking to congressional leaders, community leaders about what we can do literally in the next couple of weeks to get assistance to the New Yorkers and their communities that are struggling the most. So As we were talking about a moment ago, I testified for 4.5 hours in front of Maxine Waters and her committee. I've been talking to Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer. And because of my leadership, not only having led HUD, but also managing the $4 trillion federal budget, I'm somebody that folks are looking to be able to shape the assistance that comes. And let's be clear, if we don't get assistance, trillions of dollars of assistance in the next 2 weeks, as the moratorium on evictions is expiring, as people are going hungry, what is already a desperate situation in our city is going to get even worse. And so, like I said, while I'm focused on running, I'm focused on this immediate crisis and what I can do today as a New Yorker with all of the skills and the opportunities that I've had.
Thank you, Shaun. So for our next question, we recently released a report called Recovery for All that we sent over to you and other leaders within the city and, of course, other candidates. It sets forth a vision of a set of recommendations from over 80 leaders in the private and human services sector that center on small business and workforce development for displaced workers and marginalized communities. Are there any recommendations that stood out to you or that align with your vision for post-COVID recovery?
Well, first of all, Joey, I just want to thank you and all 80 of those folks who came together for stepping up. As I was just talking about, crisis calls us all to do more in our communities. And I think this is a huge contribution to the work that we need to be doing in New York City. So first, a big thank you for that. To answer your question directly, my experience is shaped by having been in public service through an enormous range of crises. I try not to take it personally. I hope crisis doesn't follow me in all my jobs. But, I started as housing commissioner in the wake of 9/11. I was literally 5 blocks from ground zero, watched the second plane hit the South Tower. And it shaped my experience deeply as housing commissioner and as a leader in the city. Many of my friends said I was crazy to step up to be housing secretary in the midst of the worst housing crisis of our lifetimes. Many people don't know that HUD is deeply involved in the long-term recovery from natural disasters. And so I worked on the rebuilding after Katrina and so many other natural disasters. And it's a big reason why President Obama asked me to lead the federal efforts to rebuild New York City and the region after Hurricane Sandy hit. And then, as if that weren't enough, 3 weeks after being appointed budget director, the Ebola crisis hit this country and the world. And so I worked deeply on the response and the long-term preparation for pandemics as the budget director for President Obama. And so what I would say is my experience looking at this crisis has been shaped by working and building after crises of all different kinds. And I think what really resonated to me, most of all, there were lots of great recommendations, but I think thematically what I saw in Recovery for All was 2 big lessons that I've learned in crisis. One is that in every single crisis, no matter what kind, natural disaster, man-made crisis, what I've seen is that those who are most vulnerable before the crisis are hit hardest by that crisis. And obviously, COVID has been a dramatic example of that. In fact, I think it's no coincidence that George Floyd's killing led to an awakening for this country just at the time that we were seeing and cities were starting to publish mortality rates by race across this country. And we saw that not only can the color of your skin lead you to economic disadvantage or discrimination, is actually causing your life expectancy to be dramatically shorter in this country from COVID, but from a myriad other challenges, whether it's police violence, gun violence, or so many other things. And so everything that we do in crisis has to begin with focusing on the communities that were most vulnerable before the crisis. And that should be our measure, our single most important measure. If those folks, if those communities aren't recovering, then we're not doing our job. So that's first thing that really stood out to me about Recovery for All. The second thing I would say, and President Obama used to say this to us all the time, is never let a crisis go to waste. And what I thought was powerful as well is that you didn't just build back. You said build back better and stronger. Use this crisis as an opportunity to accomplish big, bold, progressive things. Have a vision for what this city ought to be. And I think that's profound, because the truth is that in moments of crisis, what you see is that people look at the world differently. They know, and they're motivated to tackle big challenges. And so whether it's your urge that we really look at this crisis as a way to build a more diverse workforce in all of the infrastructure that we should be investing in, you talk about our climate infrastructure, you talk about rebuilding public housing, all of these major infrastructure investments that maybe we sort of knew we should be making before this crisis, we have to step up and make them now. And we have to make sure that rebuilding that infrastructure is an enormous opportunity to put Black and brown New Yorkers, those who have been left behind, put them to work and put them to work in jobs that they can build a life for them and their families around.
Thank you, Shaun. Our next question is really more granular about the workforce system. So what steps would you take to make the system more data informed, to ensure that the services are more easily accessible, and finally, more responsive to the labor market needs, as well as the needs of New Yorkers?
Yeah, so look, I think one of the things that I also thought was powerful about your work, and it really is a theme that for me runs through so much of what I see in New York City, is that more and more there aren't coalitions that bring together the public sector, the private sector, nonprofits, and really allow New York City to move forward. Too often we stand divided. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about the work that you're doing, the coalition that you've built, but also around workforce as an issue that can bring New Yorkers together, is that, to be very specific, I think there are far too many New Yorkers that see quote unquote good jobs coming to New York, that see job growth in our last decade or more, and can't see themselves in those jobs, can't imagine that one day, if I do the right things and take the right steps, that I too can participate in the jobs of the future in New York City. And that one issue, that lack of being able to say, I can see myself in the future of the city and in the best jobs, divides New Yorkers as much as anything else. If you take, whether it's the fight we had about Amazon, that we're having right now about Industry City, or so many other things in New York, that lack of a group coming together to saying, not only here's the vision, but here's the actual way that we're going to make sure New Yorkers who've been left behind too often have a future in the best jobs in the city, it is an enormous contribution, not only to putting folks back to work, which is the most urgent priority right now, but also building an inclusive New York that brings everyone together. And so I think it could not be more important, this work. What I would say more specifically is that I really believe that this connection between where our kids go to school, what they learn in school, the connection then to hopefully college, whether it's community college or 4-year, and then into the workforce. While we have great programs and great examples that are happening around the city, whether it's P-TECH or so many other things that your members are doing, the fact is we haven't really built at scale a system that can connect that through line from school all the way through to career. We used to talk about it in the Obama administration as cradle to career. And at the end of the day, that's really the responsibility of the next mayor is to take the great work that you're doing and build a more systemic approach that can reach scale for so many New Yorkers. And so I'm a big fan. I really believe that we have the tools, we have great examples. You know, CUNY, for example, is one of the great opportunity engines in the country. If you look at the data, miraculous progress that many folks, people of color, low-income folks make in terms. Now we could do better, but it's still, we have a lot of assets to build on. All of your members doing remarkable things, but what we really need to do is make sure that there is a system. I want to start a New York City Job Corps that makes sure our young people have jobs, whether it's wage subsidies that are needed, public jobs. I think we ought to go big on apprenticeships and make sure that that is a really important through line there too. And then I think we need to take on some of the structural challenges. This is something I learned very much in the Obama administration, where our work on Ban the Box and other things, for too many folks who have been involved in the criminal justice system, which obviously is disproportionately Black and brown folks in New York City. We have to make sure that we're building a system that we're requiring workers to look at those folks, giving them the tools, but also changing the rules so that they have an opportunity to be able to find the jobs of the future. So, many things like that I think we need to be working on. I also will say you all are the experts, and this is one conversation, but I'm really looking forward to engaging with you and your network on a regular basis to bring the best ideas forward. I've got over 100 folks working on policy teams, more than a dozen policy teams right now. And if I'm going to be the candidate of the biggest, boldest progressive vision, I need your ideas to make that a reality as well.
Thank you. We'll make sure to get those ideas over to you over time and continue this conversation. In terms of this question, talk about your first 100 days. What do you expect your priorities to be?
Well, first of all, let's be very clear. We can't wait for the first 100 days. If we don't get this pandemic, this health crisis under control, then those first 100 days are going to be brutal as they are right now. We're still going to be having to make brutal choices about reopening businesses, sending our kids to school. And so I want to focus too on what we need to be doing right now. The fact that we still don't have rapid testing, widespread contact tracing, all of the things that I learned in my work in the Obama administration around Ebola and Zika. This is the blocking and tackling. This is the basic work of responding to infectious diseases. So we have to be doing that. So my hope would be that in my first 100 days, I'm not having to still focus on those issues, that we have the pandemic under control. We also have the best healthcare system, the best hospitals in the world. And hopefully we not only have a vaccine, but we're actually able to make sure that it's safe and effective and that it's being administered in a way that gets to the highest risk folks early on and that those are solved. So if that's happening, then look, you all know it. Your members feel it in the work they do every day. What's the first 100 days going to be? It's going to be getting New Yorkers back to work. It's going to be making sure New Yorkers feel safe on our subways, walking our streets. It's going to be making sure that we have a business climate that allows small neighborhood restaurants and entrepreneurs to get back to work in their businesses. And it's going to be making sure that more broadly, the city is safe and open for business and jobs. Look, you know it well. We're seeing record unemployment. We literally have not had unemployment at this scale since we've been keeping records in New York City and around the country. More than 1 in 5 New Yorkers is out of work, and those rates are far higher in Black and brown communities. And so we need to be making sure that we are getting folks back to work. And that would absolutely be priority one of the first 100 days.
So just to dig a little deeper, just specifically on the just getting people back to work piece, what role do you imagine the workforce development system and some of our members playing in that? And when you think about getting folks back to work, what are you thinking about in terms of industries and different types of career tracks, et cetera?
Well, look, let me go back to something you mentioned in Recovery for All and that we talked about a moment ago. Never let a crisis go to waste. And so one of the opportunities, I believe, is that New York City should emerge as the world leader in healthcare and biotech. And I think we have many of the pieces in place for this. But frankly, what we don't have, and this goes back to what we talked about earlier as well, we don't have a system or an industry right now where many New Yorkers, those who have been shut out from opportunity for too long, can imagine themselves in those jobs. We know that home health aides, for example, is one of the fastest growing job categories in New York City. But what we don't have is a system that can help connect those entry-level jobs in healthcare to whether it's nursing, lab tech positions, or a whole range of other opportunities longer term in what I think can be one of the engines that powers New York's economy going forward. And I think is going to be an increasingly important industry in the wake of this pandemic. And so that's one very good example. I deeply believe that clean energy jobs are a huge opportunity. I've been working, Mike Fishman, who used to run 32BJ, is a co-chair of my campaign and a close friend. And we've been working a lot on an initiative he started called Climate Jobs. Wind power is an enormous opportunity in New York. We should make sure that the jobs shipping, assembling, and transporting those turbines is something that comes to a New York City port, and that we're training folks for that. More broadly, why can't we have solar on every rooftop in public housing in New York? That's literally thousands, tens of thousands of buildings. If every rooftop had solar panels, that would be jobs for NYCHA residents. It would lower energy and utility bills for NYCHA and potentially even become a source of revenue where we could sell power back to the grid. And it would allow us to close power plants, so-called peakers, that produce disproportionately pollution in Black and brown communities. And so it's those kind of initiatives that really look to the future and meet many, many goals, allow workforce training goals, make the city more inclusive and fair, and also really, as I talked about earlier, connect for a 14-year-old Black young man who is at a city high school and doesn't see themselves in the healthcare industry or in the clean tech industry, doesn't see a future path. We need to be building very clear pathways that way. And then, you know, we also have to recognize that none of us has a crystal ball too, Joey. And one of the things that I think it's so important about your coalition is you're the bridge between the private sector, the public sector, our schools, our nonprofits. And in a moment where we have to be nimble, where change is accelerating because of this pandemic, we need you all to be at the center of connecting those so that we can be nimble. As new industries emerge, we can make sure that our job training programs aren't stuck in the past, but are training people for the jobs of the future. And that's why I think we also have to have a much better system in place where, you know, at City Hall, you and your members are coming, meeting with me on a regular basis, really making sure that we're being nimble and we're transforming our workforce training system in real time for the jobs of the future.
Thank you. And this is my final question before we open it up to to our members and partners. So I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please do send them over to Annie on our team directly, and she'll make sure we get it. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, but please do send them to Annie first. So for my final question, what lessons did you gain during your time at HPD and within the Obama administration that you would apply to workforce and economic development issues here in the city? And how does your vision and approach differ from the de Blasio administration, particularly when it comes to issues of economic equity and opportunity?
Look, Joey, as we've talked about a lot that I've learned over that time, and certainly my work in crisis, the lessons I've learned, I've talked a little bit about. I guess there's one more big thing though that I would say about it, is that in moments of crisis, I really do believe that New Yorkers are hungry to be brought together, to have a leader who has a vision that is inclusive and brings all parts of our community together. And unfortunately, I think from the beginning, Mayor de Blasio too often divided New Yorkers, too often demonized certain parts of the city. And we know that, and you see it every day, your members see it every day, that there are young entrepreneurs trying to get businesses started, that there are ways in which we need to be supporting, not just regulating, but supporting the entrepreneurs, the small businesses that are going to create the jobs of the future. And my lesson in all the work that I've done, both at the city level and at the federal level, is to be somebody who is a consensus builder, who brings things together, who has a vision that says everyone in New York has a role to play. Just to take a very specific example, I've been working to make sure that every New Yorker is counted in this census. It's an enormously important issue. I mention it just to say, if any of you haven't filled out the census, if you're working in communities with nonprofits or other organizations, urge them to make sure every New Yorker fills out the census, because frankly, it is the way we get money, respect, and power in New York. Billions and billions of dollars of aid for our schools, for our housing, for so many other things come through the census. And it's enormously important that we do it. I'm part of a coalition that's brought together every sector of New York to try to make sure that we do that. And I think we need more efforts like that. You all are an organization, a group of organizations that do that. And as a candidate and as a mayor, that's who I want to be. And that's what I've learned, is that we have to bring New Yorkers together and do things together. This is a moment where every New Yorker has to be part of the solution. And I'm someone who has done that at every step along the way.
Thank you. So now we're going to open it up for some questions from some of our members and partners. Our first question is from the director of the New York City Center for Youth Employment in the Mayor's Office, David Fisher. His question is, what is your assessment of K-12 education reforms over the last two mayoralties, and what more should the Department of Education be doing to prepare K-12 students for career success, including post-secondary education and training?
So, look, very, very broad question. I think there is an urgent need to be thinking about many, many aspects of K through 12. And I do give Mayor de Blasio credit for making pre-K a huge priority early on. It's something that we thought was one of the most powerful things that we could do in the Obama administration nationally. And that early learning period is so critical. But I think we need to build on that progress and do more in a number of different ways. So specifically around workforce, as I mentioned earlier, I do believe that we have some very good examples like PTEC and others that have begun to form the kinds of connections that we need to career, the kind of cradle to career connection that I talked about. I think those have become even more urgent in a moment where we're seeing record unemployment. And for me, it really is about how do we take those examples to scale. I also believe that we need to be doing much more to look at integration and inclusiveness in our schools. Let me just step back from schools for a second. One of the things I've worked on my whole career is racial segregation in our neighborhoods. And the fact is that our schools are segregated in large part, not entirely, because our housing in our neighborhoods are segregated. And so we need to do a lot more to ensure that we're building inclusive communities in New York City. It's something I was a leader on at the federal level, as we mentioned earlier. The work I did is now being attacked by President Trump because it's such a powerful example of how we attack structural racism. But there are also things that we can do in our schools specifically. I think there are great examples in Brooklyn and a few other districts around the city of small scale efforts that have really started to show promising results. The question, again, like with the workforce system in general, is how does the next mayor take those specific examples that are working and build them out at a systemic level so that we can really attack these problems of inclusiveness in our schools at scale?
Our next question is from Karen Bornarth, who is the head of workforce development at Hot Bread Kitchen, one of our members. How can we both support small business owners who are struggling even before COVID and improve job quality for those in hourly entry-level roles?
Well, first of all, I want to go back to something Joey said a moment ago, which is I think too often government takes a stance of we're in the job of regulating, we're not in the job of helping and providing tools, whether it's to small businesses or many, many other folks. And so I want to make sure that we actually have a system that's providing supports and tools. And that begins with, frankly, making it much easier to do business in New York City. One of the things that I think is enormously powerful, it's something you focused on in your Recovery for All report, is, and this is again in the vein of never let a crisis go to waste. How can it be that we have not built in New York City the digital infrastructure necessary to make sure that every community can get access to filling out every form they need in a simple, easy way online, whether it's the technology that kids need to go to school in this moment, whether it's the ways in which a senior is trying to get telemedicine or other things. We need to make a big investment in closing the digital divide in this city. And I think that's a powerful thing that could help small businesses, small business owners, and those who want to start businesses. Because right now, we don't have enough access, and we don't have enough access to city services in a way that is easy, one-stop shopping that allows those businesses to work effectively. So that's just one example of the kind of thing that I think, particularly in this climate when there's going to be really earth-shattering change in so many communities for small businesses. Unfortunately, we're already seeing too many neighborhood businesses and restaurants and others fail. We're going to need to be generating hundreds, if not thousands, of new businesses in the years to come in New York City to rebuild job growth. And we have to cut down the barriers to starting a business and growing a business in New York City.
Thank you. And I appreciate you highlighting the digital divide aspect as well, because while that was an issue prior to COVID, it's been an illuminating issue during this current crisis as it relates to everything that we all do, specifically for workforce development, the small business sector, and educational institutions. So that is a major challenge that I hope that you'll help us address here in the city.
Totally agree. And look, Joey, this is just to build on that. It's one of the ways when we think about structural racism and how it affects our society, this is just another example, is when you don't have access to the tools in the same way in Black and brown communities that make so much of important parts of life possible in New York City right now. Again, school and so many other things. It's just another example of the disproportionate impact that this crisis has had.
We agree. Our next question is more broadly related to the human services sector, which you know that many of our members are nonprofit organizations. And while, to your point earlier, our coalition is really a space where the private sector and the public sector really meet, and people and businesses meet. Many of our organizations are nonprofit organizations. So our next question is from Wayne Ho, who is the president and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council. Wayne asks, the city contracts out $4 billion to human service organizations, but it continues to underfund the salaries and overhead costs, pay us late, have bureaucratic systems that hinder our work, and deprioritize our essential services. What is your plan to support the human services nonprofit organizations, and how will your administration have a partnership with human services sector?
This is a great question, and frankly, I feel your pain very directly, Wayne. As I said, my very first job coming back to New York City after finishing school was at a nonprofit. I started in the Bronx, and I've been working for decades at nonprofits, but also with nonprofits in government. And I think this is an enormous problem. It's not just in workforce, but we need to think of nonprofits from the government side as critical partners, not treat them as if they can get by on just some duct tape and a few dollars. We need to make sure that we're paying attention to them as organizations that are the critical lifeblood of the city in so many different areas. And so first and foremost, we need to make immediate changes to city contracts and the way we work with folks that take account of COVID. This is something that you recommended in your Recovery for All report. And it's absolutely right. I talked to so many of my friends who work in the nonprofit sector who are struggling with, well, we potentially could lose funding because we're not able to provide services in person right now. Obviously, we're not because of health. We're being told we can't, and yet we're potentially going to be hurt on our contracts. We have to prioritize paying nonprofits and keeping them alive. There's so many different aspects of that. But more broadly, I would say a couple things about what we need to do in our relationship with nonprofits in the workforce system and more broadly. First, we have to restructure the way we work with them so that there is adequate funding to be able to grow and develop as organizations. And that's something that I found in housing across the board, is that we might have for-profit housing owners who are allowed to take fees or get working capital out of grants. We say, oh, you're a nonprofit, you don't need that. But that's not true. You need to be a healthy, strong organization to be able to survive through times like this. And that means making sure that across the board, we build in ways for nonprofits to not only survive, but thrive in the work that they're doing, and to grow to scale, and to build their workforces, to train folks, to do all the things that you need to be doing. Second is, I think we need to find ways to ensure that nonprofit leaders are part of the conversations that are happening in every policy area. This is something that I did not only in New York City as housing commissioner, but also at the federal level. Is I had regular meetings every month with nonprofit leaders in housing to really talk about our plans, how we're doing, what we're getting right, what we're getting wrong, and to see those nonprofits as thought partners, as partners in the vision that I'm developing, and then making sure that I'm accountable as a leader to nonprofits in terms of the ways things are actually working. It's a little too easy when you sit in City Hall or you sit in the White House to think you know what's happening on the ground. But in many ways, nonprofits are the eyes and ears of the work that we do. And we need to find ways to support them. Let me just give you one example. When I was housing commissioner and we started to see the Great Recession, the big housing crisis and Great Recession emerged, I got together with folks at City Hall and some friends outside and started an organization called Greater New York, which was exactly focused on how we support and build our nonprofits through crisis. And what we started doing is matching nonprofit leaders with leaders from the private sector and the public sector for mentoring relationships, to get support on analytic and strategic help, and to be that support network that nonprofits needed from each other and from the city more broadly. And that's exactly the kind of spirit I would bring as mayor, is to see nonprofits not as contractors, but as partners.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. 2 points in terms of one, Greater New York. I know a number of our members, the leaders specifically at these organizations, have taken part in that. So it's an incredible initiative. But also, I hope you will continue that process, if elected mayor, of inviting not just the housing leaders into the room and having that discussion, but of course the workforce and other sector leaders.
I've said it on air and in public. I think we're being recorded, Joey. So you got it. I will definitely do it.
Great. Our next question is from Angie Cometh, who is the University Dean for Continuing Education and Workforce Programs at the City University of New York, or CUNY. Can you speak more about public education and how to ensure stronger connections to CUNY, which is one of the nation's largest and strongest economic mobility engines? And then this includes not just our community colleges, but our entire system, the faculty, senior colleges, graduate schools, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, this is a subject we could spend another hour and a half on, because I think CUNY is really a jewel, and we need to do more. But look, first of all, I would say the CUNY system broadly is a huge opportunity. I also think our community colleges specifically are an enormous opportunity, and I think too often we don't give community colleges the respect that they deserve, and especially for those Black and brown New Yorkers, those who are going to have trouble finding the resources to go to 4-year, that want to make a faster transition into jobs. That's something that we have to focus on. When I was budget director, one of the things I felt most passionate about was President Obama's proposal that we should make community college free in this country. We need to be doing more to ensure that that is a huge resource. And that was true before this crisis hit. Now that we're facing record unemployment in New York City, it's that much more important that we make that transition. I specifically spent a range of time with Gail Mello when she was running LaGuardia Community College, thinking about how we build specific pathways there into job sectors. We talked a little bit, Joey, about health. We talked about renewable energy as potential job paths, but I think there are a range of other. Technology is a good example. And I think what we've seen is that too often coding boot camps and other kind of entry tracks into the jobs of the future are disproportionately available to white folks and don't have connections into community colleges or others. I think we can build on-ramps and other types of strategies to make sure that community colleges really are feeding into those. And then the other thing, one other example I would just give of where I think we have a huge opportunity with CUNY. Many New Yorkers don't realize that CUNY trains a huge share of our teachers in New York City. And we have a real opportunity, I think, especially given the challenges that we're facing, not just in the immediate crisis, but in the longer term recovery, making sure that CUNY becomes a real center of excellence for creating the training systems and the meeting the workforce challenges in our schools in the coming decade. We really, our educational landscape has been transformed, and CUNY as this kind of engine of training for our teachers is an enormous opportunity as well for that connection.
Thank you. We're getting a bunch of questions, and we're going to take just a few more, Shaun. Our next question is from one of our board members, Aaron Schiffman, who is the Executive Director of Brooklyn Workforce Innovations. He asks if you can share your position on Pay for Success initiatives. And if elected, will your administration work with the workforce development and human service organizations to build Pay for Success models with the city government?
Aaron, it's great to hear from you. So look, not only do I believe in Pay for Success, but in fact, I was a leader in the Obama administration around the country in getting it started. For those who don't know about Pay for Success, haven't worked with it, essentially what it is a model for bringing capital from outside government and putting it towards generally social services, but other kinds of programs that have real payoff in the long term. And this is a huge problem in government, and I've seen it beginning with my work in homelessness, is that too often a family loses their home, and the alternative that government has is a shelter. And what we don't think about is that when a family goes into a shelter, not only is there enormous human cost, but there's huge fiscal costs to the city as well. Kids are moving around in schools. Families end up using emergency rooms more for healthcare, and the whole range of other costs. And what Pay for Success allows us to do is to capture the savings that often come with smart investments in services and bring outside capital to those to put them to work. One of the very first Pay for Success models in the country was at Rikers to do job training and reentry services that we knew had huge payoffs because they dramatically lowered the chances that someone who's coming out of Rikers would end up back in Rikers in a short time. We were able to raise capital from outside of government, put it to work. And I've always thought this was important. Aaron, to your question, if it was ever important, it's particularly now. We're going to be facing a budget crisis in New York City, unlike any we've seen in a generation. There's now a $9 billion gap in the budget. Hopefully, we get assistance from Congress in the next few weeks that tightens that, but it's going to be a challenging few years. And so innovative ways of finding new capital, like Pay for Success, are exactly the kind of strategies that the next mayor needs to bring. We need to be reimagining the way that we bring resources and that we make innovative things happen on the ground. And I'm really glad you asked about it, because Pay for Success is a great example of that kind of new thinking, that imaginative thinking that I can bring.
Our next question is from Lisa Futterman. Lisa is the New York City Regional Director at the Workforce Development Institute, or WDI. Her question is, career and technical educational schools are struggling with funding cuts, causing reduction in career programming. Do you have ideas of how businesses could provide financial support, given that they will benefit from a more skilled and diverse talent pool graduating from these schools?
Well, first of all, let me make a broad point. This set of budget challenges we're going to face is, as I said a moment ago, unlike anything we've seen in a generation. And I want to be very clear, and this is something I thought was really important theme that you raised in the Recovery for All report, which is that we cannot let austerity make a set of choices for us that mortgage the future of our children, mortgage the future of our small businesses and job generators in the city. We have to take a really smart, tough approach to the budget. And look, President Obama asked me to lead the federal budget at a time we came into office, and there were, at that point, record deficits. we actually brought the deficit down faster than any time since World War II, and at the same time made huge investments in progressive priorities. That's the same challenge that we're going to have in New York City for the next mayor, is how do you make the smart decisions that achieve savings but continue to invest in key priorities like workforce training. Second, and this really goes to your point in the question, is that we have to do a better job of creating partnerships that allow us to look for other sources. Aaron just talked about pay for success. That's one example. But we ought to be getting businesses much more directly involved. You all, again, this is where you are the bridge. We need to be making sure that we're going to those businesses in the industries of the future, in healthcare, in clean energy, in a range of others, and saying, look, it's in your interest. And I've seen the data, I've worked on programs. If you can lower turnover, if you can bring more trained workers, that has huge payoff in terms of retention and productivity for these businesses. Make that case and get the private sector investing in those training programs and the workforce programs more broadly in a way that we haven't done before. And I think this goes back, Joey, just something we talked about earlier. If the next mayor can actually make this a city that works for everyone, that can bring the city together and create a consensus that hasn't happened under Mayor de Blasio, then I think we can get those folks to the table and have much better partnerships. But if we demonize the private sector, if we say that the private sector is the problem in the city right now, then we're not going to be able to build those kinds of partnerships. Yes, we need companies to step up and be good citizens, but we also need them to be part of the solution. And that's the spirit I'm going to bring to City Hall.
Thank you. This is a question from Santa Soriano, who is the Director of Government Relations at CSS, or Community Service Society. She asks, if elected, how will you ensure your team, particularly your policy team, is diverse and more representative of the community?
Well, what I would say is don't take my word for it. Look at the teams that I've built in every job that I've done over the years. Look at the work that I did to put diversity at the forefront of every agency that I've led. And look, you know this, I know this. The truth is that when you build diversity into your team, you make better decisions. You actually bring perspectives that find solutions that a team that is not diverse would never come up with. So this is something I've always felt was in my interest as a leader, is to make sure that I build a team that's as diverse as possible. That's along racial lines. I was a leader, as I said earlier, first cabinet secretary ever to endorse marriage equality. We did an enormous amount of work on making sure LGBTQ folks were not ending up homeless, because there's huge risk that they will. And so on many different aspects of diversity, this is something that has always been an important part of what I do. And let me just end on one note there. I'm going to get choked up here. You know, I met John Lewis almost 30 years ago. As a college student, I got obsessed with the history of the civil rights movement. I had a roommate from Birmingham, Alabama, and we started reading the great chronicles of the civil rights movement at that time. And we had this crazy idea that we were going to retrace the route of the freedom rides on the 30th anniversary. That goes all the way back to 1991. And we cold called John Lewis. Never expected that we'd end up sitting across the desk from this icon of mine. And not only did he give us a meeting, when we said, we want to be just like you, and we're going to have dinner at a Chinese restaurant in Washington, D.C. the night before we leave on our commemoration, because that's what you did when you were Freedom Riders. He came to the dinner. He laughed and talked and told stories with us. And when I stepped out on the platform for President Obama's inauguration, I looked out at a sea of people on the National Mall. The first thing that came to mind was the Great March on Washington. And who was the very first person I saw standing on the platform, a tear rolling down his cheek, was John Lewis. And I walked up to him and I gave him a big hug. And for me, this issue of making sure that America lives up to its promise. In our founding words, we said all people are created equal, and yet our original sin was that we did not live up to those words. And for me, this moment that we're in, I believe we are seeing an awakening of people across the country to how deep that original sin goes to the roots of this country and to the work that we need to do. And so for me, this commitment, I feel, goes back more than 30 years. It's a commitment that's about building diverse teams, but it's about building racial equity into every single decision, every day, every week, every month that I've been a public servant. And it is something that has to come first.
Thank you for sharing that story. John Lewis is an incredible icon and a lion, and I'm sure most of us join you in celebrating his life and miss him.
Miss him a lot.
Our last question is actually from my colleague Annie, who you spoke with earlier. How do you think the city should be preparing for the impact of automation on the workforce, both the changes we are seeing being expedited now by COVID crisis and in the coming decade?
Wow, this is another one of those questions, Joey, we could spend over an hour on. And look, the truth is that this is an area where the city has to do more and really prepare for the future, because this was urgent before COVID hit and the broader economic crisis that we're seeing. We've now, what we're witnessing is an acceleration of trends that were already happening, whether that's in automation, in the way that our kids go to school, obviously, in the way that we get healthcare, so many other things in our lives that will potentially radically transform the day-to-day lives and how we do our jobs. But it's also leading to pretty profound shifts in industries, whether it's the question of, are we ever going to see storefronts full again in New York City? And what's the plan that we need to make sure that our streets, our small businesses can come back to life? And what's that going to look like? And so there's so many profound ways that things were already changing that have now been accelerated. Not to mention trends that I worked on extensively as budget director, whether it's automation of vehicles, which could lead to profound disruptions in the many folks who drive cabs or do other things, delivery drivers, other things. So there are really potentially profound changes coming. I've been working very closely with experts, national experts and local experts around this. Mike Fishman, who I mentioned earlier, who was the president of 32BJ, and then we worked together in Washington, is a really interesting thinker about the future of work. And I think one thing is we should be humble about being able to predict exactly what those impacts are. And part of what that means is we have to make sure that we're building a work system that ensures that families can survive and thrive. We talked a lot, Joey, already about what we need to be doing on the training front for that, but there's a whole range of other things that we need to do as well. One is we've got to build a system of safety net and supports that are much more flexible. one of the things that folks forget about Obamacare is that it was a fundamental change that allowed people to get good health insurance, even if their job mobility, if they're changing jobs, they may be a independent contractor. It brings the power of, a collective to being able to get affordable insurance for those who are much more likely to be in transitions because of the gig economy. So that's a good example. We should be doing much more to make sure that we have the power to organize folks and to get living wages at a time when the uncertainty of regular hours, contracting and other things is becoming an even more important issue. And I think that those kind of profound shifts in the economy mean you both have to be flexible and training folks, giving them the skills, but also thinking about how you build the support systems underneath folks in a time that is seeing profound accelerating change in the workforce.
So, Shaun, thanks so much for all your thoughtful responses to the questions. This was fantastic, and appreciate you being the first of our fireside chats. You've heard about the critical issues in our community and across the workforce sector, but I'd like to give you a few minutes, if you'd like, to make a closing statement and add anything that you haven't already shared or would like to further address.
Well, Joey, first, I'd just like to start with a thank you for this and for the opportunity to talk today, but more profoundly for the work that you and all of your members are doing. I imagine when you took this job not too long ago, you never imagined you'd be facing the most profound workforce crisis in our lifetimes in this city. I'm a little older than you and other folks. As I said, my passion and commitment for public service began with walking to school and asking myself, how can it be that in the wealthiest city in the wealthiest country on earth, families are sleeping on the streets? How can it be that what I saw and I knew was the greatest city on earth was coming apart at the seams during my childhood? We are facing that kind of crisis today in New York City. And the question for the next mayor is, how do you bring the biggest, boldest, progressive vision? How do you reimagine the way the city works to make it a city that works for everyone? And I believe my vision and my experience make me a unique choice for New York. This is the city I grew up in and that I love. This is a moment where every one of you on this call today can be part of not just building back, but building better and smarter and stronger. Together, we can lead this city to be the place that we imagine. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun. And that concludes the first of our conversations with the 2021 candidates for New York City Mayor. A quick program note, please join us in 2 weeks from today on August 20th for the second of our Meet the 2021 candidates. We'll be speaking with Diane Morales, former executive director of the Door and the Phipps Neighborhood Center. This conversation will be followed by Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams on September 10th, New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer on October 10th, and retired Brigadier General Laurie Sutton on November 5th, and others to be announced in the coming weeks. Thank you all for joining us this morning. And of course, once again, thank you to Shaun for being here with us. We really appreciate your time and your dedication to our work, and wish you good luck with your candidacy. And enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.